Thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank my RAs on this project, Svez Todorov, Sarah Kamala Anaraki, Anthony Hung. I'd like to thank SSHRC for its support of the Productivity Partnership, Statistics Canada for Data, and my long-term collaborator at Statistics Canada, Brian Murphy. Nonetheless, all the opinions you see or you'll hear are mine. I'd also like to thank Brian for his excellent talk and putting Canada in this comparative context. As indicated, I'm going to just do a somewhat deeper dive into the Canadian data. I'm going to make the following main points. So first, as you would have gathered from Brian's talk, that the rise in Canadian income inequality in the 1980s and 1990s was a top-end phenomenon. But it's not at all clear that this rise continues. It's a male phenomenon, but somewhat less male in the sense that an increasing percentage of the top end of the income distribution is female. There are important regional differences in Canada, just like there are important international differences. And that also makes us wonder if there's going to be a single specific cause that we can pinpoint given this variety of experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about other types of inequality, inequality in wealth, inequality in health, inequality in economic opportunity, although I will focus on income inequality. And then I'm going to conclude with kind of a mixed review of Canadian tax policy responses to this increase in income inequality. So start with looking at the basic income distribution. This is a chart of income shares by decile for Canada from 1982 to 2017. It's pre-tax income and pre-transfer income. And the first thing I'd like you to notice about that is that the pre-tax, pre-transfer income share of the lowest decile, that's the lowest 10% of the population, is essentially zero. Secondly, and for people who are trying to follow this, I'm sure we can make these slides available later for people who want the detail. The lower 9 deciles, basically you can see there's no change over this period. These are basically straight lines. The shares are pretty much constant over time. The next thing I'd like you to notice is that we look at the very top decile, and you can see there was a change. They went from about 25, 26% to about 29%, maybe an increase of about 4%, something like that, during the late 1980s and the 1990s. But that increase of about 4 percentage points, then it just stopped. And then the mid-2000s on, it's been pretty much flat again. I think it's instructive to do the same thing for after-tax, after-transfer income. So now we're rolling in transfers in the tax system. There's the same picture as before, but when we now look at the bottom share, you can see now that at least the bottom share, that the bottom 10% get some income because they get some transfer income. So that's up to 3% of income is the income share of the bottom 10%. But again, notice that even though it's been compressed somewhat, but because of the effect of progressive taxation, there's essentially over time little change in the lower 9 deciles. It's basically flat, straight lines. If we look at that top decile again, now there's a little bit of a change. But it's a smaller change than before. That's perhaps a couple of percentage points. So it's a pretty small change. So this is consistent with what Brian was just saying about Canada being a pretty equal income distribution country relative to, well, middle of the pack income distribution, but not much worsening in inequality. But there is a little bit of a difference here that this has all been done with survey data. And then we know that there's issues with survey data. David Green has done some work, who's speaking here later on this, that survey data maybe doesn't get the very affluent people. So if we switch to tax data, which of course is one of the great insights of Tony Atkinson, that's where we can get both the larger samples and the kind of coverage at the top end that allows us to examine the top 1%, and they're bigger increases. So the increases tend to be concentrated in the top 1% and even the top 0.1% and the top 0.01%. The top 1 in 10,000 is that. There's about roughly 2,500 people, tax filers in that category. And then if we just look at, to give a sample number, if we look at the top 10%, but we exclude the very top 1%, so we're still looking at the top decile, but we're taking out the very, very top of that, and we look at their share from 1982 to 2007 increase using tax data, you can see that it didn't change. It went up a little bit. It went up 1 percentage point. But then if we look at the top 1% share, that is the very top 1% of the population, their share during that period went up by 5.4 percentage point. So basically what I'm saying is the biggest number I've talked about in terms of change in the income distribution is this share went to the top 1%, and it increased by a fairly big number. In fact, roughly speaking, if we compare them to the bottom decile, from roughly 20 times the income of the bottom decile to 40 times the income of the bottom decile. So a big change there. And just to give you an idea, I'm using 2014, even though it's not the latest data, because 2015 was kind of an up year for this, and 2016 was a down year. So 2014 is about right. To be in the top 1% that year, your income had to be $227,000 tax filer basis, average $467,000. Going down to the top 0.01%, to be in that, you had to have $2.7 million income, average of $5.5 million for that top 0.01%, and compare those numbers to a median income on a tax filer basis of $33,000 and average income of $45,000. So that just gives you an idea of the sort of income ranges we're talking about. Now, did Canadians notice the rise of the top 1%? And yes, they did. In Canada, as in elsewhere, there was an Occupy movement. There was a series of protests. And so here's somebody from a protest in Toronto. It actually goes coast to coast. So this is St. John's, Newfoundland. This is here in Kingston. You can just see it, just that space just over there, outside. Of course, there's outside camping, which is by the waterfront in Kingston, would be a difficult thing at that time of year, but perhaps not as difficult as in Edmonton, Alberta. And then completing the coast to coast here, we're in Victoria, British Columbia. This sort of built off. There were protests earlier involving we talked about, Margaret was talking about G7, G20 meetings, which always have protests. And so in Toronto, 2010, there's one side of the protest, and perhaps a very un-Toronto image from that protest. But more recently, we had them in Quebec City, and there's some of the protest, and then again, there was some violence to that protest as well. So one of the reasons I think the reaction is strong is it's not just the increase, it's that it broke a long historical trend. So it's possible to go back to 1920 and Canada and look at the top 1% shares. And you can see the top 1% shares were very high in the 20s and 30s, and then they just plunged for World War II. But the part I've circled there is the post-World War II trend, and you can see that it continues to decline. The top 1% share continues to decline in Canada from post-World War II to about 1980. And that's driven by a very powerful increase in real wages. So as the people were doing well, things were advancing. And then it switches around 1980. And so you have to think about that there was this big change around then, where now we see the shares starting to rise. But then we also notice, we look at the very end of this, and during the 2000s, the picture is not so clear. It's kind of a bit of a roller coaster, maybe even looks like a roller coaster going down. So one thing I think is going to be worthwhile talking about is those last two observations. So if you see in that circle I've drawn, the 2015, there's kind of a spike up, and then there's quite a plunge down in 2016. So recall what happened was the Liberals, the Trudeau Liberals were running in 2015, and they said they were going to increase the taxes at the top end. And then they won, but there was a period of time at the end of 2015 where people could shift their income forward if they were able to do so. And so, of course, that's what they did. That's what you can see. People who could shift their income forward did that. And then in 2016, there's the subsequent plunge. So I'm able to do some calculations, even though the 2017 numbers aren't out. There's other sources of information, tax data, et cetera, that you can look at that is available. And it looks like some of this downward plunge is going to be reversed, but probably not all of it. So if you could sort of think of the 2017 observation as going to be kind of halfway back on that plunge, that's probably going to be a pretty good guess. But we'll see. The numbers will be released in a couple months. So remarks. First, these results are robust if we do things to smooth the data, 5-year moving averages, things like that, or we put things on a family basis, or we do adult equivalents. The top 1% was 11% female in 1982. Now it's 24% female. So there's been some increase there. Nicole Fortin, article in the Canadian Journal of Economics, 2019, talks about the top decile contributing roughly 79% to the average gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap is to some extent also a top-end phenomenon. The median age of the top 1% was 50 in 1982, 53 by 2016. Other stuff I can do on this. More or less, aging matters a little bit, but this is not an artifact of the aging of the population. It's not that important a factor here. The regional factor is fairly important. So in 2016, in the Tom Kershane Outside the Box volume, McGill Queen's University Press, Brian Murphy and I showed that half the top Canadian income surge was in fact two cities. Tale of Two Cities, that was the name of the paper, Calgary and Alberta, Calgary, Alberta, and Toronto, Ontario. And the reason is, of course, that's where a lot of high income people live. And so that's where a lot of the surge was. But I'm not going to suggest causality, but I'm going to show you a few diagrams that one of the things I want you to see when we go through them at the provincial level is that some of the provinces with bigger increases in top incomes are the ones that have the lower increases in median incomes. And so that might be worth looking for as we go through here. I'm going to start with Ontario. So to set this diagram up, it's a little bit different because you always have scale issues here. So what we've done in this diagram is we've indexed everybody so it's 1982 equals 100. And so therefore, as you look at the numbers forward, you get an idea of their increase compared to their level in 1982. So that top purple line is the top 0.01%. And you can see it actually goes above 300 at one point. That meant that if you're in the top 0.01%, top 1 in 10,000, the average income in that group more than tripled at one point. And then it sort of followed back. And you can see the same sort of thing for the other ones. But the one I want to contrast it with is you can see median income. This is Ontario alone, and it's pre-tax, pre-transfer. Real median income in Ontario, in fact, is not caught up to where it was in 1982. It's a little bit below, using the tax data. A little bit below where it was. So I'm going to reduce clutter as I go on. I'm not going to look at the top 0.01, the top 1%, I'm skipping the top 1% diagrams going forward. Here's Quebec. You can see Quebec, top incomes, the top 1%, they roughly doubled. They got up to around that 200 mark before sliding back. Median income doing a little better in Quebec, but basically flat over the period. Alberta, sort of roughly the same sort of picture. British Columbia, roughly the same sort of picture. You can see that what happened in all these cases, the top 1% their share tended to jump pretty quickly, and then there's some sign of kind of leveling off. And it was precisely during that period that median incomes seemed to start coming up. I'm not suggesting causality, but I think it's an interesting pattern. But there's contrast. There's a few provinces, not many, where it's a little bit different. Manitoba would be one. The one I've decided to show you here is New Brunswick. You can see there, median incomes didn't go up as much. They went up by about 50%. Top 1% by 50%. But median incomes actually increased some. It's not like a wonderful increase, but there's very definitely a significant increase there. So less increase at the top, a little bit more increase in the middle. And then the one that's perhaps most striking is Newfoundland and Labrador, perhaps driven by certain resource issues, but nonetheless, top 1% eventually gets caught up. Median income increases by that same roughly 50%. Now, I'm not going to show you all the numbers, but roughly speaking, the story is still mostly on a cross-Canada basis. Median and average income were not keeping up with productivity increases. Only people at the top end kept up with productivity increases. Variation across provinces and countries, as Brian has emphasized, makes it hard to specify a single cause. So that's the message so far. Obviously, there's data shortcomings in tax data. There's tax avoidance issues. There's tax havens. The one I want to talk about is Canadian-controlled private corporations, which is a data issue here. Michael Wolfson, Neil Brooks, Brian Murphy, and myself, paper, basically show that at the top end, a lot of people have their own companies. All right? And if you attribute their income, that tends to make the top shares look a little bit more. Not like dramatically more, but significantly more. Right? And also, there'd be a little bit more sign of a recent rise if we did that. And now I'm going back to a diagram I've already shown you. Remember, I was circling this off, and I was talking about the spike in 2015 and the plunge in 2016. So we can actually go back and figure out exactly what's caused that. And exactly what's caused that is people owning their own private corporations. How do you shift your income forward? Well, most people can't shift their income forward. You can't go to your employer and say, I'd like to shift my income forward. But if you're a private corporation, you can do that. And that's almost entirely all of that spike and all that plunge is almost entirely that. That's what that diagram shows us. Okay, other types of inequality. I said I was going to say something about that. So there's a paper by Jim Davies, Nicole Fontaine, Thomas Lemieux in the Canadian Journal of Economics 2017. They use there's a typo, Survey of Financial Security. And they basically find the wealth distribution stable during the period they can look at with that, and maybe there isn't that much sign of top-end growth. But in the paper, they also acknowledge this other paper by Jim Davies and his co-authors, and Tony Shorrock's particularly, Global Wealth Data Book, a famous document in this, and there the Canadian top income share, top wealth share, top 1% share is about 25.6%. And Jim Davies also did a paper a while ago at 20%. So you can get, over time, there's been an increase in wealth at the top end, but perhaps not that dramatic. Another type of inequality I think important is Kevin Milken and Tammy Sherlow in a paper show that men in the top 2 deciles of the income distribution live 8 years longer than men in the bottom 2 deciles of the income distribution. And for women, the difference is smaller, but still 3.6 years. But if you're thinking about stories that change over time, it's been pretty stable over time. So that's an important inequality, but it's one that hasn't worsened over time. I'm not an expert in indigenous matters, but I do think that it's important to say something about this. So one of the things in the Public Health of Canada report, Public Health Canada report 2018, which says that basically all the bad things in health are unequally distributed. But one of the most particularly dramatic results is the areas with the Inuit concentration, 12 years lower longevity, 3 times higher infant mortality. First Nations, 11 years lower longevity, 2 times greater infant mortality. So really important inequalities there. The inequality of opportunity. So this is the work of Miles Korak that many of you will be familiar with. I'm not going to go through it all. I'm just going to pick up one result. Canada has very high, by international standards, intergenerational mobility. That means if you're born poor, you've got a better chance of going up the income distribution in Canada than almost anywhere. Scandinavian countries, it's even better in Canada as estimated than in Sweden, not as quite high intergenerational mobility as the other Scandinavian countries, but very high. But we only have, as Brian showed us, middle of the pack income inequality, right? So income inequality, we're sort of okay, sort of in the middle, but intergenerational, pretty good. So that, I think, has consequences for the type of health policy we have in Canada and the type of education policy. And I think it's fair to say that if you know something about provincial government finances, you know that these are going to be under threat because the provincial governments are the government level in Canada that have on average, the most difficult financial problems. Back to income inequality. I told you I was going to conclude with a little discussion of income tax policy. So back to this diagram I've now showed you a couple of times. I'm only showing it again because there's this clear forward shifting and clear plunge to remind us all that everybody knows that there are responses to change in the taxes. There are behavioral responses. People will do things differently when you change the taxes. All right? But I'm also going to show you this diagram from Ontario again. Ontario increased its top-end taxes in 2012. And if you look at that, you might find and see something, but there's not much to be seen there. And if you look around that diagram 2012, there's not much. Ontario, like anything, changed in 2015, 2016 with the federal changes, but the provincial changes didn't do all that much. So I've done this for a bunch of different provinces, a bunch of different scenarios. I won't go through them, but the general finding is that the results, the behavioral consequences in terms of provincial taxes are very inconsistent. They don't line up very well. There's not apparently a single story. So we mentioned the work of Lars Osberg. He has a number of recommendations. He talks about increasing the top-end tax rate to 65%. Other policies include a carbon tax dividend, a type of guaranteed annual income, he calls it participation income, minimum wage increases, other labor market policies, very aggressive fiscal and monetary policy to try to push the economy more towards full employment. Those are his range of policies. I'm just going to talk about tax policy, so this one. But of course, we've just noticed that top income policies can change behavior, particularly with intertemporal shifting. That is, they can get people to shift income through time, but if that's the only story, maybe we're not too worried. But we're perhaps worried about other consequences of longer-term responses that people would conduct in terms of taxes. In particular, one of the things we want to know is, if we increase top-end taxes, are we actually going to get more money? right? If we increase top-end taxes, we don't get any more money. There doesn't seem to be a lot of point, at least to some people. And I actually think that's an open question. It's one of these things we really should know the answer to this, and we don't know. We're going to find out a lot because the federal government has just done this, and we'll get a few years. But there's clearly been intertemporal effects that I showed you. But what's the long-term effect? You know, we don't know. We need a few years to figure this out. So it's pretty important. One of the things I point out is that we do seem to have a kind of a fundamental coordination issue. So when the federal government increases its taxes and there's a response in terms of the income that people file, that affects the provincial governments too, right? They got more money in 2015 and less money in 2016 because of something the federal government did, which was completely out of their control. So that's a problem, right? Because we don't have necessarily coordination on those points. It is clear, of course, from what I showed you with that shifting, why the federal government immediately followed up with a lot of changes to private corporation taxes, trying to solve that problem. A lot of people say at some point around here, well, what we need to do is cut loopholes, and I certainly agree. But one of the things is that most tax preferences don't particularly favor the top end, except the ones that have to do with capital income. So there's a big issue as to how we think about capital income in the country, and one of the things is the way it affects the income distribution. I'm going to conclude. Tentative conclusions. Rise in income inequality is largely at the top. So if we're thinking about policy, we have to think about that. We also have to be clear that most of that rise occurred in the 80s and 90s. It's not so clear it's continuing. Top inequality is male, becoming a little less so. Varies by region. And there does seem to be a little bit of a tendency that the provinces with the slower top-end rise tend to have had more median income rise, more through the middle. The cause of all this is not clear. Wealth inequality has risen somewhat in Canada. Health inequality, while very important, very serious in my view, but it may not have been changing much over time. Canada scores well on estimated equality of opportunity. According to the top income tax rates have had inconsistent effects. So this is part of what makes it, what's going to happen when we've had this increase in federal income taxes, what's going to happen to revenue in the long run, I don't know. At the time I took a guess. The guess was somewhat less optimistic than the budgetary guess. We still don't know what's going to happen. Shifting income through Canadian private corporations, however, is really important. As you can read, increased top-end rates may not yield much revenue. We'll see. Story not told yet. But there is this issue about the coordination between provincial and federal governments. Thank you very much for your attention.